The sky was a sickly orange when Sarah's horse-drawn wagon came to a sudden halt. The heat of the afternoon sun felt like an unforgiving hand pressing down on her. Sarah glanced up, her heart sinking as she saw the smoke curling up into the sky, dark and thick. The air had a strange, suffocating taste. She had made a mistake, a big one. She should have known that leaving the safety of the little town, with only her baby Emma and her broken-down wagon, would put them in danger. She had hoped the trail would be safer, but it was too late now. The wagon wheel had snapped, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fix it. The horse, already nervous from the strange, smoky air, grew spooked and started to rear up, pulling at the reins. Sarah's hands shook as she struggled to calm it down. "Easy now," she whispered to the horse, but it wasn't listening. The smoke was growing thicker, the sky dimming with the threat of something worse. Her thoughts raced. Should she stay with the wagon, hoping someone would come by to help? Or should she try walking the remaining distance to safety? The fire she could see in the distance was growing bigger, and the wind picked up, sending ash fluttering down like dirty snowflakes. The air felt hot, like it was holding its breath. Emma, barely 8 months old, was squirming in her arms, her little face flushed with heat. Her cries echoed in Sarah's ears, piercing through the panic. "It's okay, Emma," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting her baby or herself. Animals were fleeing past them now. Deer, rabbits, birds, all running in the same direction. The fire was spreading, and it was clear it wouldn't be long before it reached them. The thought of walking with a baby in her arms seemed impossible, but the thought of staying here with a broken wagon and a spooked horse was worse. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead, glancing back at the fire and then at her baby, whose cries were growing louder. Emma was scared, too. She could feel it. She could feel the heat, the panic, the dread. Just as Sarah made up her mind to start walking, she heard something, hoofbeats. The sound grew louder, cutting through the crackling of the fire and the wind. Someone was coming. She squinted through the smoke, trying to make out who it was. Her heart skipped. Were they friend or foe? She'd been running from one man, her husband. Why should she trust anyone else now? The sound of hooves grew closer, the rider emerging slowly from the haze. It was hard to tell if it was one rider or more. Sarah felt a jolt of panic. Could this be a stranger? Another man who would only bring more trouble? Or was it someone who could help them? The rider's figure became clearer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was coming toward her fast, his horse galloping through the thickening smoke. The question was still unanswered, friend or threat. Her hands tightened on Emma, holding her a little closer, not knowing what to expect next. The rider was almost upon them. This could be their chance or their doom. The only thing Sarah could do now was wait. As the rider drew closer, the smoke parted slightly, revealing the figure of a man on horseback. He was dressed in fine clothes, a wide-brimmed hat sitting atop his head, and his horse was magnificent, strong and sleek with a glossy coat. The saddle was polished, gleaming with silver buckles that reflected what little light made its way through the haze. The man pulled his horse to a stop in front of Sarah, and she instinctively stepped back, clutching Emma a little tighter in her arms. The stranger's eyes were sharp, intense, scanning the scene before they fixed on her, studying her as if trying to assess the situation. "You need to leave. Now," he said, his voice commanding but calm, the urgency clear in his tone. Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. She had just escaped the grip of one dangerous man, her husband, and now here was another one, a complete stranger. Why should she trust him? Why should she follow him into the unknown? The smoke stung her eyes as she glanced at the fire, which was now advancing quickly. The air smelled of burning pine, and the heat pressed in from every side. Sarah's heart pounded as she studied the man before her, trying to decide if he was a threat or someone who could help. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking with both fear and defiance. The man gave a slight nod, tipping his hat back slightly. "Jack Morrison. I own the Triple M Ranch just beyond the mountains. The fire's coming fast, and the trail's already cut off. If you want to survive, you'll have to trust me." Sarah's mind raced. A rancher? He seemed to have the wealth and authority of someone who belonged to a higher class, someone who lived a life far removed from her own struggles. But then again, how many people had she trusted before only to have them betray her? The fire was closing in, the heat now unbearable. She glanced at Emma, who was still crying, her little face red and streaked with tears. The horse was restless, stomping the ground, snorting as it sensed the danger. The wind picked up again, swirling the smoke and ash around them. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "I can't just leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've got nothing. Everything I own is in that wagon, and my baby needs—" She stopped, the words stuck in her throat. The man, Jack, wasn't listening anymore. He was already dismounting, his movements quick and purposeful. "I don't have time for this," he said, reaching toward her and gently but firmly taking Emma from her arms. "We don't have time to waste." Jack's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Sarah could see the urgency in his gaze, the knowledge that there was no time for hesitation. "I've been through this before," he said quietly. "I lost my brother in a fire 5 years ago. I'm not about to lose you and your baby." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but the words, heavy with the weight of personal loss, struck a chord deep inside her. He wasn't just some wealthy rancher. He was someone who understood the gravity of the situation. She didn't know what to think, but her gut told her that she had no other choice. If she didn't trust him now, they'd be trapped here with the fire creeping ever closer. Jack didn't wait for a response. He moved quickly, walking toward the horse and pulling it closer to where Sarah stood. "You're coming with me. The fire's moving faster than we think." He mounted the horse once more, pulling the reins gently as he glanced back at her. Sarah took a step forward, still unsure, still fearful of what might come next, but also too afraid to stay where she was. "You can't," she started, but Jack interrupted her, his voice softer now. "We're taking the old mining trail through the mountains. It's not safe, but it's the only way out." Sarah's mind was spinning. The old mining trail? It was dangerous, she knew that much. She had heard stories about how people had gotten lost or injured on it. But the other option was to wait here at the mercy of the fire. With a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She stepped toward Jack, her eyes never leaving the path ahead. "All right," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Let's go." As Jack adjusted Emma in his arms, preparing to ride, Sarah took a moment to look back at the wagon, her heart aching as she thought about all she had left behind. Her life was in that wagon, her belongings, her memories. But now, there was no time for sentiment. She had to focus on getting Emma to safety. Jack gently handed her a small bundle, and she realized he had wrapped up a few supplies, food, water, and what looked like a blanket. She clutched it to her chest as she climbed onto the horse, the weight of Emma's small body resting in her arms. The horse's hooves beat softly against the ground, a rhythmic sound that was oddly comforting amidst the chaos of the world around them. They started down the path, the smoke growing thicker, the fire not far behind them. The world around them seemed to blur as they moved deeper into the forest. Jack led the way, walking the horse to save its strength. The wind picked up again, carrying the sound of crackling trees in the distance. Sarah clung to the horse's mane, trying to steady herself, but her body ached with exhaustion. The fire was close now, the sky turning darker by the second. "How long until we're clear?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the noise of the wind and the fire. Jack didn't answer right away, but she could see the determination in his face, the way he was scanning the trail ahead, looking for the safest route. "We'll get there," he said finally. "Just hold on." As they moved through the thick smoke, Sarah couldn't help but think about her past. She had run from one man, her abusive husband, and now she was relying on another man, a stranger. But Jack didn't feel like a threat. In some strange way, he felt like her only chance. They moved in silence for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The path they were on was narrow and treacherous, the ground uneven beneath the horse's hooves. They came to a steep incline, and Jack gave the horse a gentle nudge to move forward. Sarah felt a pang of fear, but pushed it aside. She had to focus on Emma, who was growing quieter in her arms, her small breaths ragged as she drifted in and out of sleep. Sarah pulled her tighter, her heart aching as she thought of everything she had left behind. The fire was coming for them, and they were running out of time. The old mining trail, though dangerous, was their only hope now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the fire's roar grew louder, the smoke thickening. But still, Sarah held onto hope, holding on to the belief that somehow they would survive this. The worst was still ahead. But for the first time in days, Sarah didn't feel quite as alone. The sound of rushing water reached Sarah's ears before she could even see the river, the current wild and fast as it tore through the rocky gorge ahead. The smoke swirled thicker as they neared the riverbank, and she could feel the heat from the fire creeping ever closer. Jack stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the water, his face hardening as he took in the sight of the swollen river. The water was high from the mountain runoff, rushing and dangerous, its flow looking almost uncontrollable. The fire wasn't far behind them, the crackling of the flames now a constant presence in the air. The sun was hidden behind the thick smoke, but the sky still had a sickly, orange glow to it, the color of destruction. Jack turned to Sarah, his face grim. "We can't cross here," he said, his voice low. "The current's too strong. Swimming with Emma is suicide." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the full weight of the situation hit her. They couldn't cross the river, and yet they couldn't stay here. The fire was getting closer, the air hotter with each passing moment. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. But she knew there was no other choice but to move forward. Jack's eyes scanned the horizon, the dense forest, and the raging fire. There was only one option. "I know a path, a narrow canyon that bypasses the river, but it's steep and treacherous. It's the only way." Sarah swallowed hard, glancing down at Emma, still cradled in her arms, her little face flushed from the heat and stress. She was too young to understand, but Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. The little girl's quiet sobs broke Sarah's heart, and she hugged her closer, feeling the weight of the world pressing in on her. "We'll do it," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She wasn't sure if the path was safer than the river, but she had no choice but to trust Jack. Without another word, Jack began to move toward the narrow path leading into the canyon. He didn't waste time trying to comfort her, didn't offer any false assurances. He simply moved, his steady pace urging Sarah to follow. They moved in silence, the air thick with smoke and the oppressive heat of the fire. The canyon path was narrow and uneven, with jagged rocks on either side. Jack walked ahead, the weight of Emma still in his arms, guiding the horse with his other hand. Sarah followed, her legs already aching from the long journey, but there was no time to rest. She stumbled a few times, her breath ragged, but she kept going, determined to keep moving. The fire was closing in, and she had to keep Emma safe. The sound of the river faded as they moved deeper into the canyon. The wind howled through the narrow passage, the smoke swirling and stinging her eyes. They reached a particularly steep section of the path, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. It was a sheer drop on one side, and the path narrowed to barely a few feet wide. Her heart raced as she followed Jack, trying to keep her balance, but the fear was gnawing at her, a constant companion. Jack, however, seemed unfazed. He moved with purpose, each step carefully placed, and Sarah clung to the hope that somehow they would make it through this. But then the worst happened. The horse, which had been struggling to keep its footing on the steep slope, lost its balance. The animal gave a frightened whinny, and before anyone could react, it began to slip, its hooves skittering over the loose rocks. "No!" Sarah screamed, reaching out, but it was too late. The horse slid over the edge, its terrified cry echoing through the canyon as it tumbled down the steep cliff. Jack lunged forward, his hand grabbing at the reins, but there was no stopping the fall. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow, as if time itself had paused before the sounds of the horse crashing down the rocks filled the air. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Jack, his face a mask of pain, stood there, frozen for a moment, watching the horse disappear from view. "Jack," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what to say. The horse had been his brother's, the last connection to the man he had lost in the fire years ago. The weight of the loss seemed to hang over them both, but Jack didn't waste time mourning. He gritted his teeth and looked back at Sarah. "We can't afford to stop. The fire's still coming." He moved, steady and determined, as though the loss of the horse was already behind him, something he would process later, when there was time. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and they continued their climb, the path growing even steeper as they ascended the canyon. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, the crackling of distant flames, and the wind was growing fiercer by the second. Emma's cries had quieted, her little body exhausted from the heat and the long journey. Sarah felt her own strength waning, but she pushed on, one step at a time. The canyon narrowed even further as she found herself having to climb, pulling herself up the jagged rocks with every ounce of strength she had left. Her feet were sore, her hands bleeding from the rough rocks, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. The fire was still a threat, and they had no other choice but to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small plateau, where Jack stopped and set Emma down on the ground. He scanned the horizon, his face set with determination. "We're close," he said, his voice quiet but strong. "There's a spring up ahead. We can rest there." Sarah looked around, her legs shaking, her body exhausted from the climb. But there was no time for rest yet. The fire was still coming, and they needed to find shelter. They set off again, moving as quickly as they could, Jack leading the way. The spring was close now, the sound of the water reaching them just as the wind began to pick up again. They could see the remnants of the old fire lookout tower in the distance. If they could reach it, they might be safe. The spring was just a little further, but with each step, the heat from the fire seemed to grow more intense, the air growing thicker with each breath. When they finally reached the spring, Sarah felt a momentary sense of relief. She bent down to drink from the cool water, the refreshing taste filling her parched throat. Jack, still carrying Emma, looked around, his gaze scanning the area. There was no sign of the fire yet, but they were running out of time. "We need to get to the tower," Jack said, his voice firm. "It's our only chance." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with exhaustion, but she knew he was right. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. As they set off again, Jack's face softened for a moment, and he made Emma laugh, her tiny giggles breaking through the tension of the journey. Sarah's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and fear. They were so close, yet the danger was still so real. But for now, she would hold on to the hope that they could make it. The tower was within reach. They just had to get there. As Jack, Sarah, and Emma neared the fire lookout tower, the smoke grew heavier, and the wind began to howl like a wild animal, sending ash swirling around them in a suffocating dance. They reached the base of the tower, the stone foundation providing a brief but much-needed relief from the crushing heat and smoke. The tower was an old structure built with thick stone walls, with a small wooden cabin on top, rising 40 feet into the sky. Sarah could see the look of determination in Jack's eyes as he surveyed the area. The tower was their best hope of survival now, but it was still so close to the fire, the heat, and the wind pushing against them. He moved quickly, positioning Emma and Sarah inside the stone base of the tower, protecting them from the elements while he made sure the horse was tied securely. The wind was howling even louder now, and the sky had grown darker, painted an ominous shade of black with the fiery glow from the advancing flames. The heat radiated from the ground, searing their skin even in the shade of the tower. Inside the stone base, it felt like a small, temporary shelter, but Jack knew they couldn't stay there forever. He glanced at Sarah, who was still clutching Emma tightly in her arms. The baby's quiet whimpers echoed softly through the tension of the moment. Jack could see the exhaustion on Sarah's face, but there was no time to rest. They were at the mercy of the fire and the wind, and every second counted. "We'll be safe here for a while," Jack said, his voice steady despite the growing threat around them. "The stone will hold up against the fire for now, but we need to stay alert. The fire's fast, and the wind can blow embers right to us." Sarah nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in the weight of the situation. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of what had brought her here. Fleeing from an abusive marriage, holding on to a shattered sense of hope, and now facing this fire, this raw, uncontrollable force. It had all been too much. But in the midst of this chaos, she found herself trusting Jack in ways she never expected. The man who had appeared out of nowhere had become her lifeline, her protector, and somehow she couldn't ignore the growing bond between them. They had been through so much in such a short time, and every moment seemed to deepen the connection between them. She had seen the way Jack looked at Emma, his quiet care for the child, and something inside her stirred. It was hard to admit, even to herself, but she was beginning to feel something for him. Jack walked to the base of the tower, his movements purposeful, and Sarah watched him with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. He was trying to make the best of an impossible situation, but they were running out of time. The fire was still advancing, and the winds were picking up, blowing fiercely against the tower. She heard the cracking of trees in the distance, and the distant rumble of the fire creeping closer. "I'm going to check the tower," Jack said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "Stay here, keep Emma close. I'll be back soon." He didn't wait for a response, his boots crunching on the ground as he made his way up the stone steps toward the cabin. Sarah stayed where she was, holding Emma tight against her chest, her heart pounding as the heat grew more intense. It felt like the air itself was thick with smoke and dread. The wind howled louder, whipping the smoke in all directions, and Sarah knew the fire wasn't far behind them. She had heard the stories of how quickly fire could spread, how it could change the landscape in a matter of minutes. The flames were a force of nature, unpredictable and relentless. As Sarah stood in the stone base of the tower, she heard the sound of the wind picking up, and with it, the faint crackling of flames in the distance. The storm was coming. The fire was still a threat, but now they had the added danger of the weather. The wind was picking up at an alarming rate, and Sarah knew that the fire would be even harder to control if the winds continued to strengthen. The lightning had started to flash in the sky, jagged streaks of light that illuminated the smoke-filled air. The sound of thunder rumbled through the sky, as if the storm was joining the fire, adding its own chaotic power to the already volatile situation. Sarah's heart raced as she realized just how close they were to disaster. The wind howled again, louder this time, and she could feel the tension building in the air. Lightning struck a tree not far from the tower, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the air. Sarah instinctively pulled Emma closer to her, shielding her from the storm of smoke and ash that was beginning to swirl around them. She could see Jack up in the tower now, standing at the top, his silhouette outlined against the glowing sky. The wind was fierce, but Jack wasn't backing down. He was watching the fire, his eyes narrowed in concentration. But Sarah could feel the dread rising in her chest. The wind was shifting, and with it, the embers from the fire began to blow toward the tower. The risk was real now. The wooden cabin atop the tower dry from years of neglect, was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. The wind was carrying the flames closer and closer, and Sarah could feel the heat building with every passing second. She didn't know how much longer the stone base would hold. And then it happened. The wind changed direction again, and before Sarah could even react, she saw the first of the embers land on the wooden roof of the cabin. The drywood caught fire instantly, and the flames leapt up toward the sky, reaching for the heavens. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the fire spread across the cabin's roof. Jack was already moving, rushing back downstairs. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice strained with urgency. "Get away from the tower." But Sarah didn't move. She couldn't leave. Not now. She watched in horror as the fire spread faster than she could comprehend. Jack reached her just in time, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the base of the tower. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous." Sarah resisted for a moment, her eyes locked on the tower, but Jack's grip was firm, pulling her away. She had no choice but to follow him, even as the flames grew higher, crackling and snapping in the wind. As they retreated to a safer distance, Sarah could only watch as the tower, their last hope of shelter, became engulfed in flames. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't the only force of nature they were battling now. The fire was unstoppable, and their only chance was to get to safety. Jack didn't stop, his face set with determination. They had to keep moving, but the fire was closing in, and the storm was only adding to the chaos. With every step, Sarah's heart pounded, and she knew they were running out of time. The fire was behind them, the wind howling, and the lightning striking all around them. But they had to keep going. There was no other choice. They would survive this. Together. The roar of the fire was deafening now, and the heat from the flames licked at their backs as Jack, Sarah, and Emma stumbled away from the fire lookout tower. The once solid structure now crumbled under the weight of the flames, its wooden roof collapsing in on itself in a series of terrifying pops and cracks. The storm had not given them any respite, and the wind was driving the fire closer with each passing moment, a relentless force. Smoke swirled around them like a living thing, choking the air, and the ash fell like dirty snow, coating their clothes, their skin, their hair. The sound of crackling timber and the howling wind made it feel like the world was falling apart around them. Sarah's legs were trembling, the exhaustion of everything they had been through weighing heavily on her. But she kept moving, following Jack as he led them away from the inferno. She could feel Emma's small, limp body in her arms, the baby's breathing shallow and labored from the heat and smoke. Jack's pace was steady, determined, but Sarah could see the strain on his face. They had been running from the fire for what felt like hours, moving through dense underbrush and rocky paths, their every step unsure, each footfall heavy with the weight of their situation. The fire was coming for them. It was no longer a question of whether they could outrun it, but if they could survive it. They were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by flames, with nowhere to hide. Jack's face was set, determined, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. He was struggling to keep it together, but she could feel his strength slipping, just as hers was. "We're not going to make it," Sarah whispered, the words barely leaving her mouth, but they hung in the air between them, an unspoken truth. She was exhausted, her feet raw from the long trek, her body aching, and Emma was barely conscious in her arms. The baby's cries had long since stopped, leaving only a quiet, fearful whimper, and Sarah's heart was breaking with each labored breath Emma took. Jack didn't answer her at first, but Sarah could see that he was struggling with the same fear. He was trying to hold on to the hope that somehow they would make it, but it was getting harder with every step. They had reached a clearing now, and Jack stopped, turning to look behind them. The fire was close, far too close for comfort, and the wind was driving the flames straight toward them. Sarah's heart raced as she looked back too, and the sight was enough to steal the breath from her lungs. The fire was like a living thing, a wall of red and orange, roaring and surging forward. It was moving faster than they were, and there was nowhere left to run. Sarah wanted to scream, to give up, but she couldn't. Not for Emma, not for Jack. They were all she had left, and she wasn't going to lose them now. Jack turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We're going to make it," he said, his voice firm, though Sarah could hear the cracks in it, the exhaustion that he was trying to hide. "We have to." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could outrun this, that they could survive. But deep down, she knew that the fire was closing in, and they had nowhere to go. The tower was gone. The path ahead was blocked by flames. There was no escape. As Sarah stood there, feeling the heat of the fire on her skin, she heard something, a low rumble, almost like thunder. But it wasn't thunder. It was something else, a sound that cut through the roar of the fire and the wind. She turned her head, her heart skipping a beat as she saw something that made her wonder if she was imagining it. In the distance, through the thick smoke and ash, she saw a flicker of movement, a figure. At first, she thought it was a mirage, a trick of the smoke, but then the figure grew clearer, and she realized it was a person. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the figure was still there, moving toward them through the haze. Jack must have seen it too, because he stiffened, his hand reaching for the rifle slung across his back. Sarah felt a wave of panic rise up in her chest. Who was this person? Were they friend or foe? Were they coming to help? Or were they another threat in this nightmare? The figure grew closer, and Sarah could make out the shape of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, moving quickly through the smoke. He was coming straight toward them, and in his hands, he was holding something. A fire hose. Sarah's heart leaped in her throat as she realized who it was. It was one of the ranch hands from Jack's place. She recognized him from the few times she had seen him around the ranch, but she hadn't expected him to come here, into the heart of the fire, to save them. The man reached them, out of breath but determined, his face grim as he handed the fire hose to Jack. "I've been fighting the fire for hours," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "But I couldn't leave you out here. We've got a line set up. The fire's moving fast, but there's a chance we can slow it down." Jack didn't waste a second. He grabbed the hose, his hands working with practiced ease as he began to direct the water toward the fire that was advancing on them. The water hit the flames with a hiss, and for a moment, it seemed like they might have a chance. But the fire was relentless, and the wind was still howling, pushing the flames forward faster than they could keep up. Sarah watched as Jack fought the fire, his body drenched in sweat, his face smeared with ash, but his determination never wavered. He was giving everything he had to protect them, to keep them safe. But even as the water slowed the flames for a moment, it wasn't enough. The fire was still too strong, and the wind was still driving it forward. Sarah felt her chest tighten with fear. This was it. They were going to die here, in the middle of this inferno, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But then, something miraculous happened. The storm that had been raging above them, the lightning that had been flashing in the sky, suddenly broke. The rain began to fall, slowly at first, then in torrents. It wasn't just a light drizzle, but a heavy, relentless downpour that soaked through their clothes in seconds. The sound of the rain hitting the ground was deafening, louder than the fire, louder than the wind. And with it, the fire began to retreat. The rain came in sheets, dousing the flames, turning the air from oppressive heat to cool, wet relief. Sarah stood there, stunned, watching as the fire that had been so close to consuming them began to subside, the smoke dissipating into the downpour. It was as if the heavens had opened up and sent the rain to wash away the destruction. The fire that had been racing toward them, the unstoppable force, now seemed to be losing its strength. The flames sputtered, and within moments, they were extinguished, leaving nothing but the smoldering remnants of a once intense inferno. Sarah could hardly believe what she was seeing. She stood there, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized that they had survived. Against all odds, they had made it. The rain continued to pour down, soaking them to the bone, but it didn't matter. They were alive. They were safe. Emma, still in Sarah's arms, had finally stopped crying, the baby's small body exhausted from the ordeal. Sarah held her close, her tears mixing with the rain, but they were tears of relief. They had survived the fire. They had survived the storm. Jack, his face streaked with ash and water, turned to Sarah, a tired but triumphant smile on his face. "We made it," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but Sarah could hear the relief in it. They had made it. They were alive. They were together. The fire was gone. The storm had passed, and the world around them, though scarred, was still standing. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they had a future, that they had a chance. The miracle had happened. They had survived the inferno, and now they would begin again. The rain continued to fall in sheets, the sky dark and heavy with the remnants of the storm. The fire, which had once seemed like an unstoppable force, was now little more than a smoldering memory, the heat fading with every drop of rain. Sarah, her heart still racing from the intense moments they had just survived, held Emma tightly in her arms, her mind still struggling to process what had just happened. They had been saved. The rain had come just in time, extinguishing the fire that had been closing in on them, and now, as the clouds parted and the sound of the downpour softened, Sarah found herself standing in the clearing, drenched and exhausted, but alive. Jack stood beside her, his clothes soaked, his face streaked with ash and water, but his expression was one of quiet relief. He had been her strength throughout this ordeal, and now, as they stood together, Sarah realized just how much she had come to rely on him. But just as she began to allow herself to feel the tiniest bit of peace, the sound of distant voices cut through the silence of the rain. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind, or perhaps her mind playing tricks on her after everything they had been through, but the voices grew louder, clearer. They were coming toward them, a group of people. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be a rescue party? Had someone finally come to find them? But then, through the mist of the rain, she saw the figures approaching, and the familiar shapes of men on horseback emerged from the haze. Her heart sank. One of them was unmistakable, the tall figure riding at the front, his face tense, his eyes fixed on her as if he had been searching for her. Sarah felt her stomach churn with dread. It was her husband. His face was twisted in a mixture of anger and relief, as though he had been searching for her through the chaos of the fire, trying to find her and bring her back. The other men behind him were strangers, ranch hands, perhaps, but the one leading them was unmistakably the man she had fled from. "Sarah!" her husband shouted, his voice cutting through the rain, his expression a mix of concern and possessiveness. "Thank God you're safe. I've been looking everywhere for you." His words sounded too sweet, too false, and Sarah's heart twisted in her chest. She had run from him once, and now, here he was, coming to find her in the aftermath of the fire, playing the role of the worried husband, as though he hadn't been the one who had driven her away in the first place. He rode toward her, his horse's hooves splashing through the mud, and Sarah instinctively stepped back, holding Emma a little closer to her chest. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," her husband continued, his voice filled with feigned sincerity. "I've been so worried. I thought I'd lost you, but now you're safe. You don't need to be afraid anymore." The words stung like salt in an open wound, and Sarah's hands tightened on Emma. This was the man who had hurt her, the man who had made her life a nightmare, and now he was acting as though nothing had happened. The anger bubbled up inside her, rising to the surface in a way she hadn't expected. "You don't get to do this," Sarah said, her voice trembling but strong, her eyes narrowing as she looked at her husband. "You don't get to come here and pretend like everything is fine. You don't get to act like you care when you're the reason I left in the first place." Her husband's expression faltered for a moment, but then he shook his head, his eyes hardening. "You're just upset, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "You've been through a lot. I understand. But now you're home. You're safe. You and Emma are coming back with me." He urged his horse closer, but Jack stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking her husband's path. Sarah hadn't realized it at first, but Jack had positioned himself between her and her husband, his body language protective, his face a mask of calm but unmistakable resolve. "You're not taking her anywhere," Jack said, his voice low and steady. Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the strength in his words. She had known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that Jack would protect her, but hearing him say it so firmly made her believe it. She wasn't alone anymore. Her husband's eyes flicked to Jack, and the tension in the air thickened, like the calm before a storm. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the sound of the rain, the only noise as the two men sized each other up. Sarah's husband shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. "This isn't your business," he growled, his tone low warning. "Step aside, Jack." Jack didn't move, his eyes never leaving Sarah's husband. "It is my business," Jack replied firmly, his voice unwavering. "She's not going back to you. Not after everything you've done." Her husband's eyes flashed with rage, his hand tightening around the knife. But Jack's stance remained steady. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment, and Sarah felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. But she also felt something else, a strange sense of strength, like a shield of protection that Jack had unknowingly placed around her. She wasn't going to let him take her back. She wasn't going to let him take Emma back, either. The silence stretched on, the rain falling in a steady rhythm around them, until her husband spoke again, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can keep her from me?" he spat. "She's mine. She always has been." Jack took a step forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Not anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had come before. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, but she felt a strange sense of clarity in that moment. She wasn't going back. She was done with him. Her husband's expression twisted into one of pure fury, but before he could react, the sound of hooves approaching quickly cut through the tension. Sarah looked up to see another figure, one she hadn't expected. The local sheriff, accompanied by a small group of ranchers, was riding toward them through the rain. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest as she recognized the sheriff, a man she had spoken to briefly when she had first arrived at the ranch. He had been kind to her, and now, it seemed, he had come to ensure her safety. The sheriff pulled his horse to a stop beside Sarah's husband, his face calm but resolute. "That's enough," the sheriff said, his voice firm as he looked directly at Sarah's husband. "I've been hearing stories about you for a long time now, and I think it's time we have a conversation about your actions." Sarah's husband's face drained of color, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the seriousness of the situation. The sheriff's gaze was unyielding, and Sarah felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. The ranchers who had been following the sheriff now dismounted, standing in support, their expressions wary but resolute. "We've heard enough," one of them said, his voice heavy with conviction. "We're not going to let you hurt her anymore." Her husband opened his mouth to argue, but the sheriff cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You've been given enough chances, and now you're going to face the consequences," the sheriff said, his voice stern. "You're not going anywhere near her or the child again." Sarah's husband opened his mouth to protest, but the sheriff silenced him with a single look. "You'll be coming with us, and we'll make sure you never hurt anyone again." The reality of the situation was sinking in, and Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She was free from the man who had terrorized her for so long. As the sheriff's men took her husband away, Sarah turned to Jack, her heart full of gratitude and something else, something that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Jack's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hand. "You don't need to thank me. he said quietly. "I told you, we survived together." In that moment, with the rain still falling around them and the storm finally passing, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't running anymore. She was home. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it was hers to shape. And with Jack by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next.